I'm here to talk to you about art. It is often said that art isn't useful, but I'm here to tell you that it is. The problem with art is that we think about it in the modern era as a set of objects in the world, stuff we call art, and the stuff that is art and the stuff that isn't. This is the mindset, the mechanism, that has created the art world, that has created the art market. It works very well for the art market because you have things that are valuable and things that are not. And ultimately, this has led to a version of art for the 1%, a luxury commodity, an elitist way of working, with museums dictating what other people see and what we think of as art in our society. But I want to talk to you about art being actually a way of doing things. This really came to fruition for me when I was working up in the Lake District at Grizedale Arts, based on this farmhouse, Lawson Park, in the village of Coniston. And here we would run a residency program where artists would come from around the world, around the UK, and they would come and use the landscape, the context, as inspiration to make art. Painting, sculpture, video, installation, film, things that look like contemporary art, especially when they're put in galleries. And this was a process of extracting from this context and really providing product that benefited the art world mostly, but perhaps less so the community that we were part of. We tried to get people to participate in projects in art, to make it work socially. This really came to a head, this thinking, around the time of 2005, when we ran a water festival with the village. And in that, we tried to integrate contemporary art projects with artists working with the community to make things like this, a performance about a radical scout group from the 1930s. But it was after this particular moment, I remember a farmer coming up to me and saying, "How much longer do we have to participate in these art projects? When are you going to do something for us?" And he was right. But it was also slightly shocking in a way, because we had worked with them. We had developed the idea for the festival and all the artful projects that were in it with them. But what was interesting was the things that looked like their everyday culture were successful. The things that looked like weird contemporary art you see in galleries weren't, because it was talking a different language. It wasn't part of their day-to-day experience and the culture that they know and they grow. So on the back of this, we changed everything. Rather than necessarily inviting people to come and make art in the traditional sense, we invited people to make art in the wider sense, as a way of doing things. And so, in terms of culture, we invited agriculture. That's a language that they would recognize in Coniston. And so, we did a residency for 7 septuagenarian farmers from the village of Togei in northern Japan. And these 7 70-year-old farmers came to the Lake District worried that they were missing bracken season. In Japan, bracken is more expensive than asparagus. And when they arrived, they saw the hillsides filled with bracken. So the obvious thing was to run a bracken restaurant. Now, in the Lake District and in the UK, bracken is thought of as being poisonous. But here, it is a wonderful cultural product, bringing people together. So the bracken restaurant showed what you might do with a bit of creative thinking in a different context by bringing in people with creative ideas. And this proved to be a success. This was the switch that flipped. Yes, we get this. We understand what this means to bring other people, to bring artists, to bring creative minds into our community to help us look at things differently and make things happen differently. This catalyzed the community. And so the village hall where we ran the restaurant was developed with us and with our local residents as a place for coming up with new ideas. And rather than us inviting them to be part of an art project, they then invited us to be part of theirs, to be part of their culture, to join in with the Harvest Festival, the Christmas lights, the country fair. Now, this way of working started to attract attention. It started to gain the attention of other people in the art world who were thinking similar things, who were trying to escape this small bubble of what the art world was and expand it into something richer and more meaningful for a wider number of people. So as part of this, we worked with the artist Tanya Bagheera, who was also thinking like this, an artist from Cuba, the Van Abbe Museum from Eindhoven, and we created a movement called Arte Útil, art as a tool, an international network of projects and people campaigning for this idea of art that isn't just a picture of something, but is a process of transformation, that is about making things change, art as a tool for social change. And we created a website and used this to highlight case studies around the world, hundreds of them, that you could then use, you could pick up and have ideas for your community that you could then follow and make things happen in your own space. A key example, and one that's very pertinent to me, is the Granby 4 Streets Regeneration Project from Liverpool, where a community group from Toxteth invited a group of artists, designers, architects, a collective, to come and help them with their project, which was to save their neighbourhood from demolition that had been earmarked for housing market renewal by the powers above. But they reclaimed their streets and they worked with Assemble to refurbish and repurpose the dilapidated housing stock using the raw materials around, bits of wood, bricks to make fabrics, fireplaces, furniture, rebuild the buildings in a way that worked for them on their own terms. Now, at this time, I was also invited to be a member of the Turner Prize jury. And I thought, knowing that the Turner Prize likes a bit of controversy, that maybe we could sneak in a bit of non-art into the Turner Prize, or a bit of art that wasn't like the art we know. And so I suggested that Assemble and this project should be on the shortlist. I think it was the longest jury panel discussion ever in the history of Turner Prize, and it swung from here to there, heated debate, argument, but at the end, Assemble won. And despite the protestations that it was enough that they were just on the list, Assemble won. And there was a gasp in the presentation at the awards. And I remember very clearly being approached after the announcement by an art dealer, finger jabbing me. "You've broken art," he said. But in a way, what he really meant was art had been broken for him. He couldn't use this art on his terms. This was art other people used on their terms. You didn't need him to explain what it meant because the meaning comes from how you use it, not because you're told it's art. So how could we apply this thinking to art as a whole, to the museum, to the gallery, to our cultural infrastructure, as a nation, as a way of thinking? I was invited to become director of Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, a shiny, glossy art museum in the manner of the Museum for the 1% that was built to regenerate Middlesbrough, to give it a bit of sheen, to make it a player in the world. But of course, Middlesbrough is not a shiny place. This is the neighbourhood of Gresham, 200 metres from the museum. This is the neighbourhood where the refugees and the asylum seekers live, packed into houses in awful conditions. And I remember when I started, there was a mayoral election taking place. And there was an independent candidate campaigning on a ticket that he was going to close MIMA down because it was elitist. It was not for us. We need schools, we need hospitals. We don't need this thing you call contemporary art or modern art. So I wanted to prove them wrong. So the first shot across the bows that we did was in a way something I call reversing the polarities. Rather than importing art from elsewhere, rather than doing the international blockbuster, we did the opposite. We did a show called Localism, local art for local people, if you like. And we crowdsourced it. We said to the town, if you were going to write a history of culture in Middlesbrough, what would be in this exhibition? What would be in the museum? How would you write your story about the way you as a community use art? And this pile-up of material that gathered over time, with people bringing things in and suggesting things of the designs for the Sydney Harbour Bridge, sculptures, paintings, slideshows, music, became this wonderful cacophony of their version of what art is, their version of what this means to them. And I remember the mayor coming to the opening. Well, not the mayor, he didn't succeed in getting in, but he missed by 3 votes. But he came up and he said, this is brilliant. This is what a museum should be. This is how it should work for our community. And on the back of this, MIMA became a convening space, a planning space, not just a place to show art and to kind of visualize our culture, but also a place where we could plan how we make culture, how we make society in the future, including a weekly meal for 150 people, free, cooked for us, for the public, for the mayor, for the police, for homeless people, for asylum seekers, all convening around a table to come up with new ideas for how we might change the culture of the place. And learning through this making process is absolutely fundamental. In a way, it's partly what we've lost through the history of the exhibition, because art is a way of making as well. And this process of making teaches us how to transform one thing into another, whether that's a pot or a whole city. So how do we train ourselves again? And this project is a very good example. Working with those very residents I showed you in the neighbourhood of Gresham to build a Trojan horse. Symbolic, a gesture, a way to campaign for housing that works for them, but also training the building skills necessary to refurbish the houses themselves, to take control in a genuine way. And on the back of this, we secured 3 houses transferred from council ownership to this group so that they could start to build their neighbourhood again on their terms. Now, history is also useful in this, because useful art isn't a new idea, it's a really old one. The Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, where I now work, was built for the perpetual gratification of the people of Manchester. It was built to transform the textile industry of Manchester in the 19th century, to create visual literacy in the population so that Manchester would fire forward as a global superpower. It was also a place to create healthy minds and healthy hearts and healthy bodies. But ultimately, it still became a shiny temple of modern art. So how could we revisit this and again repurpose using the same strategies, same ideas in the mainstream, in one of the biggest galleries in the UK, to really take this to centre stage? And what's very interesting in this, when we invite people to come and use the museum rather than just us using the museum, the curator folk, is it means that they have recourse to talk to power. The Reno is a project now underway at the Whitworth. The Reno nightclub was at the centre of Moss Side in the 1980s, in the middle of the race riots, Thatcherism, and everything else that was going down then. The nightclub at the centre of the Afro-Caribbean community was the place where they went to meet, to express their culture, and to convene and plan for the future. These are photographs from an oral history that they started to make, the regulars of the Reno nightclub, in recent years, to remember this club that ultimately got bulldozed through regeneration because it wasn't seen as being culture that was relevant for the wider world. So we have invited the Reno nightclub and all its regulars, now 30 years on, to come and occupy the Whitworth, to have a gallery space for a whole year at the centre of the museum to show their culture, including the findings from an archaeological dig of the nightclub, digging up old pint pots, digging up beer crates, ashtrays, bags of drugs, all to go on show in the art gallery. There's Linda Brogan, the leading force behind this community group from Moss Side, who previously were committed to their culture, but saw our culture, the Whitworth, as not for them. But now they are welcome in, and they are defining and expressing their culture to the wider world, but discovering and finding out through this process what kind of new cultural institution they need now in Moss Side to help them change their society, to change their world, but also to speak to us, to have them as critical friends who will criticize us and remind us that we shouldn't just show what's being shown in New York or Paris or decided by market dealers somewhere else, but to make this culture and to make our museums an expression and a place of making for everybody in society. And in a way, that is beautiful. That is an artistic process. Down the road at the Manchester Art Gallery, I was rummaging in the archives to try and find why the hell this building was built in the first place. What was it for? What are these places for? How do we reimagine them? And of course, if we dig in the history, we find the original plans from 1823 by Charles Barry, the architect who won the competition. And on the front cover of his plans in Latin, it says, nihil punctum nisi utile. Nothing beautiful unless useful. Thank you.